I'm Lynn Crace. I work for the University of South Australia. I'm a repeat offender of many ASIA projects. And I was pleased to be brought into this particular project, which, unlike the previous presentation, which ran over a number of years, was quite a short and condensed project that came more towards the end. My interest more generally has been in institutions, and I'm an economist by training, so we could spend a lot of time talking about the definition of institutions, but I don't want to do that. I want to give some sense of what was achieved within our project and how it feeds into some of the other projects. So the official title of our project was Institutions to Support Intensification, Integrated Decision-Making and Inclusiveness. And our main project partners were Jahinga in Bangladesh and Avanish in India. As I said, there's a proclivity with institutional projects to spend a lot of time fussing over how we describe things. One thing that does define this particular region is that there has been no absence of effort to create different policies and different rollout mechanisms over the years. Unfortunately, what tends to happen is often those are not fully evaluated in terms of their effectiveness, and often there's a tendency to leave them continuing to run without sufficient political appetite or will to close them down. So rather than get too bogged down, and because we were dealing with such a big region and such a diverse and complicated problem as identified by Avanish's presentation, we chose instead just to simply ask key policymakers initially what they saw as the main policy instruments and delivery institutions that would effectively improve the lot of smallholders by increasing and making more stable their farm incomes. And I'll talk a little bit about how we sought to do that. So we were looking for those particular institutions and policy combinations that were likely to be more effective. Obviously, that's a very big statement and a lot of area to cover. So what we decided to do was not just look at effectiveness, but also the extent to which it might be preferred by smallholders. So it's one thing for a policymaker to view something as being effective. It's another thing completely in terms of whether the recipients of that policy are likely to prefer it. And to make this manageable, we chose to focus our efforts across 3 different domains: knowledge transfer, the management of groundwater, and also risk management. And spanning across that, we also intended to try and tap into some understanding around inclusiveness. So the intention was to have inclusiveness components that looked both at women and tenant farmers with respect to those 3 domains. And as my colleague Bethany Cooper can probably attest, trying to round up across programs and across different domains is very difficult at times. I'll talk briefly about how the project rolled out, and then I'll also talk briefly about where we landed as a result of COVID. The intention of the project when we mapped it out was to, as I indicated, to start working initially with the high level policymakers. And to do this, we instigated a 2-round Delphi process. Delphi literally means to ask the expert. This had the added advantage that it created a pathway for us to come back and have conversations with those same policymakers when we had managed to assemble some results, particularly the results that were coming back from farmers. So it was always the intention that this would be one of the conduits that we would use to try and get some of that leverage that Christian had asked about. What we found, perhaps not surprisingly, was that it was very difficult with just a 2-round Delphi to extract clear messages about what was really effective. So we then added a 3rd step, which was to introduce a best-worst scaling experiment, where about 100 policymakers participated in that experiment to give us some understanding of what they thought was likely to be most effective in these areas. The intention was then to move that same scaling process across to work with farmers. We piloted it with farmers, refined that instrument, and then to move to an online survey administration to try and collect that information and to administer a large survey that would then gather all that data and enable us to make those comparisons between those 2 key groups. the policy group and the farmer group. What we did find was that there was quite a degree of conformity across a very diverse region, that there were a couple of things that really came through. One was that despite all of the policies that were on offer, whether there be subsidies, whether there be other things, one thing that consistently came through was a view by the policy community that a gap was around access to inputs. So it was felt that having better access to inputs would probably deliver higher and more stable incomes than a lot of the other policy options. There was certainly an appetite amongst some policy makers or some of the policy community around new technologies, and there's an interesting gender dynamic in that was certainly preferred by male policymakers compared to female policymakers. In terms of delivery mechanisms, there was also a very strong message from the policy community that the private sector should not be dismissed in this regard, and that a more vibrant and supported private sector seemed to be something which was favoured by most in the policy community. What we didn't know, of course, was whether this resonated with farmers and smallholders. So as I indicated, we had intended to roll this out as a primary survey instrument to get insights into that. We had designed it to apply that instrument across the 4 jurisdictions which were of interest, as well as the various domains. And you can see that we hadn't intended to administer the whole survey in all parts, but at least sufficient coverage to give us some comparison across jurisdictions. So we had done most of the hard work with respect to working with the policy community, trialling with farmers, testing instruments, being ready to deploy them, even to the point of having the survey all ready to go in digital form, loaded onto tablets and to be administered. So this is a very significant investment with respect to our project, because to design these sorts of instruments carelessly usually yields very poor data which can't be used. So we felt we'd invested a significant amount of time in order to make sure we're going to optimise our chances. Regrettably, and we've heard this theme a few times, regrettably we have been struck by COVID, and that's much worse in the region than our part of the world, I'll admit that. And so the possibility and the prospect of rolling out that survey instrument to deliver the data that we wanted to use to make the comparisons between farmers and experts simply couldn't be harvested. That said, we remain very hopeful that when the situation improves in South Asia, that we'll have sufficient support to be able to gather that data and then continue and complete the analysis. So what happened as a result of the intervention of COVID, we felt it really important to still continue to try and fill some of these gaps. So we used the resources that we had and the time that we had to extract as much primary data as we possibly could, and also to leverage from as much secondary data to try and help fill some of those questions or answer some of those questions that had come through our work. With respect to the take-home messages around water, we were fortunate to be able to at least administer a primary survey by telephone and to collect some data around that. We also undertook a number of other secondary studies. IFPRI did some of those, we did some of them ourselves at UniSA also, and we will manage to put together some policy advice, at least at this point, which centres around a few points. One being that there was a clear pattern, at least in some of the IFPRI work, that strengthening of governance at the state level in West Bengal would be a priority if we were going to improve water management. It also was very clear that irrigation of itself in this particular part of the world, in fact, this is probably not unique to any part of the world, but irrigation of itself is not likely to be the panacea to deliver increased and more stable incomes. And we also felt it was really important to investigate more of the linkages between energy reforms that were occurring in particular states and how that was impacting on groundwater markets. And there's a couple of papers being produced around that, which complements the work that was done by IMI as well. We did find with our primary survey that there were quite significant differences in preferences across different types of water users, particularly women compared to men. And we felt that there was some possible convergence ideas that we could use here which would deliver more inclusive outcomes rather than less inclusive ones. With respect to knowledge transfer and the role of extension, this work was largely undertaken by the team at BAU, and I congratulate them on doing that. They did find a number of different interesting lessons that were buried in the data. This was mostly secondary data, like, for example, the fact that there was a material improvement in productivity that could be traced to the profitability of rice farming, even when we took into account many of the other variables that were moving at the same time. And interestingly, there was also the rather strange spillover effects. There did seem to be a lot of spillover into things like women's empowerment. A lot of that work we do need to interrogate a little more to try and get a better understanding of where that's coming from. With respect to the risk body of work, because we didn't have the primary data, we extracted what we could. A lot of this ended up centering on production risk, but there was a crossover with Brendan's team, and we were able to do some simulation modelling in that regard. And in particular, we felt that when we ran some of that simulation modelling with the data from Brendan's team, we thought that it really showed some areas where there might need to be some intervention to try and permit that wider scale adoption to occur. But there are a number of variables there that are critical, including the opportunity cost of labour, which needs to be better thought about. Importantly, working with Avanish in particular, we scrutinised some of the programs that are trying to support farmers more at the income level. And I think a really important take-home message here for ASIA is that it really is important to start thinking beyond agriculture and beyond what ASIA can deliver, and maybe thinking about the broader role of government, how it might support some of those systems that are needed to shift to a subsidies to income rather than subsidies to input approach. On the inclusion front, we did find clear evidence that technology can be used, and technology, we leveraged from some work which was around mobile technologies in India, but our own primary data was also showing this strong linkage between technology, and if we're clever about the way we provide access to that technology, it can produce very significant beneficial outcomes for women in particular. We did find, and this came from trying to use the secondary data, we did find that there are big gaps in this data, which led us to query, whilst governments have made very significant commitments to inclusion and empowerment, it wasn't always particularly easy to measure and to keep track of. And so we were encouraging a much wider discourse on that particular topic as well. I'll conclude my presentation there. Hopefully I haven't taken up too much time. There is a very significant body of published work that's come from this. I think there's best part of 20 odd papers that are available. Most of those are at various stages of review, and hopefully that will provide some basis for some additional work in this space.